Ladies and gentlemen, this is Nicky Muscle from MitigateStress.com. In this video, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into trigger point therapy release, also known as self-myofascial release or MFR, myofascial release. If you're getting a massage, it's called MFR. If you're doing it yourself, self-myofascial release, using a barbell, softball, lacrosse ball, Theracane, or other specialized pieces of equipment. Or maybe it's more surface level, such as guasa, scraping of the skin, or Graston, performed by like a physical therapist or something like that. All this is good stuff. But I wanted to do this video to create more clarity because there is quite the spectrum when it comes to this topic of extremists, whether they are the people that think it's completely useless, they don't understand the importance of it. We definitely don't believe in that, or the people that think it's foundational, it's the most important thing. We definitely do not believe in that. We're kind of somewhere in between. It's basically just a tool in your toolbox, and for different people, it's going to make a difference, you know, whether you're doing it more often or less often. Really, it's just going to be dependent on your lifestyle, where you are in your health and fitness journey, how your posture looks, and how debilitated you are. If you're very deconditioned, you're very debilitated, you're in a lot of pain, you're probably going to want to start with a lot of trigger point therapy release, just so you can get into the corrective exercises that we want to show you. Because ultimately, like we said, it's just a tool in your toolbox, but is by no means not nearly the most important tool in that toolbox when it comes to movement. And like we talked on our recent video, the 4 pillars in our Mitigate Stress protocols, we have movement as one of the pillars, nourish, environment, and mental. And in the movement one, we have 4 subcategories. That is walking, that's your self-diagnostics tool. We have trigger point therapy, we have corrective exercises, and we have play. And we're going to do videos on each and every one, diving deeper and deeper each and every time. But out of those 4 subcategories with movement, trigger pointing is the least important. But again, it is just a tool in your toolbox. And in this video, we want to show you how to utilize and maximize that tool in your toolbox. So one, you're not wasting your time, because you can very easily, and I have many times, spent hours wasting my time with trigger pointing, and then the next week I'm like, well, that was a waste of time. So again, in this video, let's clarify some things. Before we dive into more of that, let's just kind of go over what is proper trigger point therapy release. So first of all, it's called, again, MFR, myofascial release, or self-myofascial release, or TRP, I like to call it, trigger pointing. And the first thing is, whenever you trigger point, you always want to go deep tissue to the bone. So if you're trigger pointing your quad, you want to try to get close to that femur bone as much as you can. Go deep, deep to the bone. And there are some parts of the body that are very deep, that are very inaccessible, that are the most important parts to hit that we cannot hit with trigger point therapy release. And that is the ribs, underneath the ribs, and the pelvis, primarily speaking. And those parts can only really be accessed through proper corrective exercises and proper gait function, gait mechanics, practicing the gait mechanics themselves, such as walking, running, and throwing. Movement, to start decalcifying those deep layers of hidden fascia from years of trauma, stress, and dysfunctional movement patterns. And going back to why trigger pointing is the most important, because you can trigger point all day, but if you're not overriding these faulty movement patterns, the software, you're going to keep reverting back to your faulty, dysfunctional, traumatized movement patterns, whatever you want to call it. You have to override these faulty movement patterns that you've accumulated over the years of stress, trauma, etc., whether you were, since you were 5 years old, 10 years old, wearing backpacks, stressed, sitting a lot while stressed. Certain things aren't necessarily bad. For example, like sitting isn't necessarily as bad as people claim it is to be. It's really the people that are stressed when they sit and how they sit is really the problem. So it's the trauma, it's the stress, and again, it's the faulty movement patterns. And oftentimes it's also the overdevelopment of one side. For example, people throwing just with one arm the entire time. You want to become ambidextrous. If you're a fighter, try southpaw, try orthodox. Judo, try another side. And I see time and time again with athletes, not just people on low athletic levels, but also top level athletes. Athletes that I talk to, I tell them time and time again, like, you guys got to be training ambidextrous. Yes, you're winning fights, that's great, but you're in pain. You're one step away from injury, and that injury could cost your career. You've got to become ambidextrous. So again, trigger pointing has its limitations. If you're just trigger pointing all the time and you're not implementing some form of movement plan like we talk about in our free recovery routine down below, and we will be discussing coming soon in our walking guide, it's going to cover all that stuff, then you are just doing yourself a disservice. You're wasting your time. It's helping you. It's hydrating the fascia, but again, you're not overriding the software. That's the most important. One more thing too. Let me do another analogy. Let's say You can do corrective exercises and gait mechanics all day and become a very, very healthy human being without trigger pointing. You can't do trigger pointing alone without correctives and walking and gait mechanics and become a very healthy human. There's just no way. So you can do one without the other. You can't do one without the other, if that makes sense. So again, MFR, let's talk about trigger pointing, how to trigger point correctly so you don't waste your time. If you are trigger pointing, when you do, you have to go deep tissue to the bone, number one. You have to go deep tissue to the bone. You have to use the right tools for the right job, the right angles. And number two, you have to make sure that you're going a sustained amount of time and pain. So we like to say 2 to 3 minutes at the very minimum, or roughly 3 to 5 minutes each trigger point that you find. And then you're going long enough, but you're also going deep enough, roughly an 8 out of 10 pain. That's very abstract or arbitrary when we talk about 8 out of 10 pain. But basically when I say that is you don't want to ever enter into that fight or flight state. And that goes with the play subcategory of movement as well. I was actually just learning about this recently more in depth. And with play, why play is so important is because there's a lot of scientific studies that suggest that play allows us to learn way better than being stressed, obviously. So for example, let's say fighters are sparring, right? Dutch fighters tend to go way too aggressive, and sometimes that can create a lot of fight or flight. I'm not saying it's wrong, but a lot of science does suggest that when you're in that fight or flight, you do not learn nearly as well as when you're more relaxed. For example, like the Thai fighters in Thailand, Muay Thai, they do a lot of play, dynamic play. It's kind of like tag, but they're learning a lot. And that's why, in our opinion, they're the best, Muay Thai fighters in the world. But there's a lot of concepts, analogies to that. I don't want to get into that too deep, but very important that you never enter into that fight or flight state. We're here to relax, obviously. We're here to mitigate stress, dump stress. Therefore, you want to go as painful as you can handle without entering into that fight or flight state. Just to recap, deep tissue to the bone, long enough, deep enough, 3 to 5 minutes roughly each trigger point. You can go longer if you need to, and then roughly an 8 out of 10 pain, never entering that fight or flight state. Number 3 is technique, or rather doing your correctives during your trigger points seems to help a lot. For example, let's say we're doing our hamstrings, our upper hamstring. We're going to engage our quadricep, or rather knee extension, to elongate the hamstrings, to create the lengthening of the hamstrings while tensing the quads. So that's going to stretch the hamstrings. It's going to engage the quads a little bit. And that's so much better than just kind of sitting there flaccidly, soft, just kind of resting on that ball. Yeah, it might be painful, but you're going to get so much more out of it if you also create a stretch on top of that and engage the stretch. So it's not passive, but it's more of an active, engaged stretch, right? So respecting that length tension. You can't ever have length without the tension if you want optimal biomechanical function and hydrated fascia, for that matter. So joint manipulation, technique, correctives. Again, remaining calm, never tense, breathing slow, relaxing, and finally, hot spots. So what I mean by that is there's a certain amount of hot spots in the body that are somewhat unique for each and every individual, but what we have found that most people are very similar to these hotspots. For example, for the quads, it's going to most likely be the quad 45 is the worst on everybody. And if you release that quad 45, you're going to find that that makes a huge impact on the rest of the leg and the body for that matter, more than if you were to waste your time and do the entire quad. Yeah, you'll get the entire quad done. You'll probably feel better, but we only have so much time during the day. Let's say if we did the quad 45, you'd have like 75% effectiveness. But if you did the entire quad, you might have 100% effectiveness, right? But if you do the quad 45, you did it for 3 minutes, and then you go do a corrective exercise, it allows you to get into that corrective exercise much easier. That's the point of the trigger point. And then you go walk, that's your self-diagnostics tool to see if you've improved, and you can practice your gait mechanics. And then you go back to the lab, you rinse and repeat, you do some play, etc., etc. You're going to save so much more time if you just focus on those heavy hitters, those hot spots, rather than trying to just mindlessly trigger point the entire body. I've done that before. It's such a waste of time because, again, you're just going to revert back to your default faulty software settings. You don't want to do that. So hot spots, hamstrings, that'd be like your upper outer hamstring. Quads be the upper outer quad 45. The abs would be your upper abs. The pecs would be your pec minor. The lats would most likely be your upper mid lat or the rear delt lat kind of connection right there. Traps, right there. The calves would be more like the soleus, And the list goes on and on. The groin would definitely most definitely be up in the upper pectineus region near the groin. And then, yeah, I can keep talking about this for quite some time, but not really, because there's only a certain amount of hot spots. And again, you're going to save so much time, but I like to view it as this. If I unlock that one major blockage in the dam, it's going to start flowing the rest of the dam. But if I start hitting all these other little areas, I'll get little bits of flow and circulation and drainage, right? But again, if I were to hit that big block, it's going to just knock it out, and it's going to start flooding the whole rest of the body. So it's going to open up that massive channel, which is going to just make such a big difference rather than just wasting time with all these little ones. It isn't going to make that much of a difference. Clarity recap. Again, trigger pointing is a tool in your toolbox. It is not a waste of time, but it is most definitely not the foundation. So how we like to utilize it is this. We go on a walk. That's our self-diagnostics tool. We become aware of, okay, I have a little pain in my left knee. Maybe you have someone recording your gait mechanics, you're walking. Preferably not on a treadmill, but sometimes it has to be done because it's hard to kind of film someone on even service with a camera, but it can be done. And it's more natural, obviously, to film someone on the ground in nature or on a sidewalk or something, because your hamstrings are actually pulling the ground rather than the treadmill moving, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, the treadmill's not curved. There's so many different mechanics and variables that we have to take into place. But nonetheless, it is very important that you become aware. You can use a mirror if you're in a big gym or something, or again, just have someone filming you to become more aware, or you can just start to feel as well of where any pains are. You take that pain, you take that information that you gathered from that walk, that self-diagnosis, and then you go into your lab and you do your trigger pointing. But you also combine that with a corrective, most importantly. You don't just mindlessly trigger point. So we say, okay, my hamstring's pulling. I'm gonna go in the lab. I'm gonna primarily do a corrective for my hamstring. But before I get into my corrective for my hamstring, and again, when we think of hamstring corrective, we don't just think local. We think of the body as a systemic approach, as a global approach. So we're going to hit our hamstring as a hinge with the entire body involved rather than just the hamstring, right? That's what I think a lot of corrective or physical therapists tend to fail on, is they just localize these issues, and it's such a pathetic waste of time. And I did it for years. You're just wasting so much time. You have to address the body as a whole. And so again, you go do your corrective for that hamstring, which is total body approach. And then before you do that corrective, you hit that upper hamstring with a deep tissue trigger point for 5 minutes roughly each side, involving that length tension relationship like we talked about. And then that allows you to get into that corrective so much easier. You don't have to trigger point before, but some people you do. Again, if you're very debilitated, you can't get into that corrective, that's when you're going to have to trigger point that before you do that corrective. It's going to make it safer. It's going to hydrate that fascia. It's going to make it more mobile, especially temporarily, of course. But in the long term, too, if you combine it with that corrective, it's going to make it more mobile for, again, the long term, because you're hydrating it and then you're re-correcting it. You're recoding that software. You're overlapping those crappy, faulty movement patterns with optimal gait-based corrective exercises. Again, you can learn more about this in our free recovery routine down below. And again, we also have our walking guide coming out soon, where we'll go into so much more depth, so much more detail on all these things. But hopefully that made sense. Just to recap again, trigger pointing is just a tool in your toolbox. It's not completely useless. It's definitely not the foundation. You have to use it at the right times. When you're just starting out, you're definitely going to want to trigger point more for like 30 minutes a day at least, just to start rehydrating the fascia so you can get into your walking, so you get into your corrective exercises much more efficiently. But as time goes on, the better you get with your mechanics and stuff, the less you'll need. Simple as that. Also, the more intense you go, the less time you need. The more present you are, the more aware you are, the less time you need. So again, deep tissue to the bone, go long enough, go deep enough, make sure you're relaxing. Utilize proper technique and correctives in that length tension relationship during the trigger points to maximize its efficacy. And then focusing on hot spots, heavy hitters that open up the channels, the flow much more efficiently, rather than picking those little twigs out for the dam to flow. You're just taking a big chunk out, and that's just letting the water gates or the floodgates just flow open. That's pretty much it. All right, guys. Got any questions? Let us know down below. And if you want a video request, support@mitigatestress.com. Email us, shoot us a comment. If you got anyone that is struggling with pain or they're wasting 2 hours a day trigger pointing, send this video to them, and we'll see you next time. God bless. Peace.